Chapter 7 of Peggy's Trial by Mary Knight Potter. Recording by Leanne Howlett. A Hint of Dreadful Trouble. It was some weeks after the baker's departure, and Peggy was not having a very good time. She missed Elsie for one thing, and then for some unknown reason Miss Barton had not yet got back. That meant that a Miss Garland was still teaching the Sunday school class, and Miss Garland never gave her the nice little mid-week parties that Miss Barton used to give. Miss Garland, too, never once came in between times and took Peggy and the two boys on excursions or brought them games. Miss Garland, in fact, seemed to take very little interest in Peggy and none at all in Teddy and Harry. Privately, Peggy thought her a very poor sort of a lady indeed. The only reason she failed to make her conviction more decidedly public was that the despised person was a friend of Miss Barton. Ted and Harry felt no such scruples about expressing their opinions. Harry had even been known to stick out his tongue at the back of Miss Barton's successor. About this time, also, the children were thoroughly agreed that Nurse was getting too pudgiky for toleration. That they themselves were on a naughty streak did not occur to them. "Why," said Ted one day with wrath, "she won't let a fellow do anything. Yesterday I had Jimmy Haynes up in the attic and we were just playing, and she kept calling for us to come down, and of course I wasn't going to come down for nothing. And then she came up and she took me by the ear and she most chucked me downstairs." Ted was standing in front of the nursery fireplace as he spoke. His short legs were spread far apart, and his hands were tucked behind him under his diminutive coat-tails. It was an attitude he much admired in his father, and he copied it as often as he had a chance. "What were you doing in the attic?" questioned Peggy suspiciously. "Doing?" Teddy looked as innocent as a 6-month-old baby. "Nothing. I was on the rocking horse and Jamie had on his roller skates and was just skating along, dragging me and the horse after him. Nurse said we'd knock down the ceiling if we didn't stop. Guess if the whole house didn't come down in last year's tornado, that little racket wouldn't pull down a ceiling." Peggy thought that was not bad reasoning, but she was a whole year older than Ted, and she felt that she ought to be on the side of discipline. "Well, you know, Father told us we mustn't jump around up there as if we were outdoors." "Wasn't jumping," said Ted indignantly. "And Jamie said 'twas just as easy skating as if he'd been in the rink." Peggy's curiosity got the better of her moralizing. "How did he ever pull you along on the horse?" "Oh, we had it fixed in great shape," explained Ted enthusiastically. "You see, we took my skates and Harry's, and we fastened 'em under the stand of the horse, 2 at each corner, tied 'em on with strings. Of course, every little while they'd come off and then we'd go slump, but it was easy as pie and great fun. There." Harry had been cutting out puzzles in the other corner of the room, but now he came up in much excitement. "That's how my skate got its front wheels broken. You can just give me yours to pay up." "Well, I guess not." Ted swelled up like a turkey cock. "'Twasn't I smashed 'em nor Jamie either. You can make Nurse get you a new pair. She's the one busted 'em. She grabbed the rocking horse and she switched it round so, trying to get me off, that the skates hit a trunk and got a piece knocked off. You needn't be blaming me." Harry's blue eyes filled with tears and his mouth took a tremendous downward slant. "You shall give me yours," he sputtered. "It's your fault if Nurse did break them. You know she won't get me a new pair." "Well, you can go without 'em then," said Teddy heartlessly. "I didn't want her to come banging me round, did I? I didn't tell her to break those wheels." Harry's eyes blazed with fury and ran over with tears at the same time. "You're a bad, wicked boy," he stormed, "and I hate you." With a sudden fury he pounced on his brother and began beating him with both his clenched fists. Before Ted could defend himself, Peggy was between the two, trying to separate them. By this time both of them were so excited that they hardly knew what they were about or whether they hit each other or Peggy. "You are naughty boys," she cried, still valiantly trying to act as guardian of the peace. Just then Nurse came into the room, and seeing what she thought was a three-sided fight, she swooped down on the trio remorselessly. "Were ever three such young ones born into the world?" she scolded as she shook and parted them. "You needn't be blaming me," expostulated Peggy, smoothing down her dress. "I wasn't doing a thing." That seemed like the biggest kind of a fib to Nurse. "I guess I can see with my own eyes," she retorted, "and I guess your father'll have something to say when I tell him. Now you, Teddy and Harry," she took each firmly by an arm, "you'll both of you go straight to bed this minute, and you'll stay there till tomorrow morning." Telling Peggy to wait in the nursery, she marched the two boys out of the room without allowing them a word of explanation. "Oh, dear," said Peggy ruefully, "now she'll go and tell Father, and he'll think I'm a wicked girl, and I can't ever make him understand." As she thought of all the consequences, her wrath grew, and by the time Nurse came back she was in a towering rage. "I'll tell you what I think," she burst out as the old servant re-entered. "I think you are an unfair, mean woman. You won't listen to anything anybody can say, and you just go and repeat everything to Father and oh!" She stamped her foot angrily. "You're just horrid. So now." Peggy did not know that Nurse was tired out and half sick. Nor did she realize that 6 consecutive years with 3 lively children are apt to wear out the strongest of nerves. Neither did she know that a certain piece of village gossip was rankling in what was after all a very faithful-hearted nurse. Least of all did she guess that this same heart the very moment before had been feeling very sorry for Peggy herself. At this sudden onslaught, Nurse's pity gave way to anger. "You are a saucy girl," she said bitterly, "saucy and ungrateful. You don't remember how I've taken care of you all these years, nor how I saved your life when you had the scarlet fever. You don't care for anything except to do just as you please. But I can tell you one thing, Miss Peggy Clayton, your day is most over. I guess you'll find the difference when your stepmother comes. I guess you won't have quite such an easy time then." At the word stepmother, all Peggy's color fled from her face. She stood gasping and white, staring at Nurse in horror. Then she pulled herself up in fine scorn. "You are just saying that," she said indignantly. "You know my father wouldn't marry again." "Huh?" Nurse's own racked feelings were glad of a chance to vent themselves. "I guess I don't know any such thing. Your father is going to be married inside of a month. He's been calling on her night after night in Carver, and I'm glad somebody else is going to have the training of you. By this time next year I guess you'll wish you had your old nurse back." With a sniff and a choke she left the room. For several minutes after she had gone, Peggy stood motionless. Suddenly she dropped onto the floor by the couch and buried her face in the cushions. "Mother, Mother," she sobbed, her little frame shaking with anguish. "Oh, it can't be true. It can't be. There can't be anyone come to take your place. Father wouldn't let him. I know he wouldn't." But her words did not convince herself. She knew that Nurse never lied, and the only chance was that there was some mistake. "I know what it is," she said to herself at length, drying her eyes and looking a little comforted. "Daddy's been visiting some sick lady for a long time, and they think he is going to marry her. It's just people's talk. It isn't true. I know it isn't." This seemed a reasonable explanation, both of her father's unusual absences and of the town gossip. For a few days she believed it, or persuaded herself that she believed it. Yet really, she was always half expecting to hear that, after all, Nurse was right. She bore meanwhile such a quiet, strangely unchildlike air that Nurse was almost abashed. She never once dared to say anything more about the matter, which was by now all over the town. End of Chapter 7. Chapter 8 of Peggy's Trial by Mary Knight Potter. Recording by Leanne Howlett. The trial has come. But one day Peggy overheard 2 of her teachers talking about her father and his wife-to-be. She could not catch the name of the future stepmother, But the evident certainty in the women's minds and the things they said finally made the truth come home to her. Her father was to be married. Her own dear dead mother's place was to be taken by some other woman. It was only the morning recess, but Peggy slipped out of the schoolyard. For the next 2 hours she hardly knew where she went. At first she was merely filled with a sense of the burning injustice that was being done to her mother. She could but just remember the tall, stately lady who had died when Peggy was hardly 5 years old. But the memory meant all that was most sweet and sacred in her short life. To think that that place was to be filled by some strange woman seemed more than she could bear. Soon, too, she began to remember all the horrible stories she had heard of stepmothers. They not only hated their stepchildren, according to Nurse, but they made fathers dislike their own children. Sometimes they even drove the poor little things out of the house. Peggy was in the woods half a mile from home when all the terror of these thoughts came to her. She and the boys were to be scolded, beaten, and their dear father taught to hate them. Then she thought to herself remorsefully that she was wicked to believe he could ever turn against his little daughter and sons. But again she remembered what she had once heard Nurse say to Sally. "There isn't anything a wicked woman can't make a man do." And everyone agreed that stepmothers were all bad beyond description. So there was no hope for it. Ted and Harry and she were to be outcasts, hated and scorned, with a loving father turned into a very fiend of ferocity. Peggy's imagination was always one of her strong points. The pictures she conjured up now of all the horrible things that would happen were so vivid and real that it seemed almost as if they were happening that minute. Down on the snow she dropped, and big sobs shook her little body till the very well of tears had completely dried up. Exhausted at length with the fury of her grief, she sat up, a miserable heap of a girl. Her face was almost as white as the drifts of snow about her. Presently she began talking aloud to herself. "Never any more father to love us. Nobody to put us to bed, because of course she won't let Nurse stay. Everybody hating us all the time. It will be just the same as if we were babes in the woods, only we won't have any robins to cover us up with leaves. Most likely we'll die of starvation and nobody will care. Oh dear, if we only hadn't been born. Or if only something could happen to us right off quick so we needn't stay any more." She paused a minute and clasped her hands together tightly. "Why," she whispered, looking about furtively as if someone could hear her, "why, we could go away ourselves. Nobody wants us. We'd better go. Mrs. Baker said she'd be glad to have me any time. I'm sure she would take the boys, too, when she heard about the stepmother. Most likely in a little while I could earn some money and take care of us all." Peggy was not exactly sure how this could be done, but she had earned as much as $2 in one season picking berries and selling them to her father. Consequently, she believed she could easily get something to do, enough to pay their board at least. There was no time to be lost. She thought rapidly. No one seemed to know exactly when the stepmother was to arrive. Everybody appeared to think, however, that it would be soon, perhaps by tomorrow. It was past noon now. Unless she hurried, the boys would have finished luncheon and returned to school before she got home. To her relief, she found them still at the table. Both boys looked gloomy and sullen, but she was too full of her own thoughts to be curious about them. As soon as the meal was over, however, Ted laid hold upon her. Before she had time to tell him the dreadful news, he and Harry had dragged her up to the nursery. "Nurse says we've got to go to bed again before supper," began Teddy, viciously kicking over a chair. "And 'tisn't for a thing," interrupted Harry. "Just for nothing except because she's so ugly herself." "That makes 3 suppers in a week," continued Ted. "All for nothing, too. One thing." He wagged his head triumphantly and unbuttoned his blouse. "I wasn't going to be hungry tonight." As he spoke, he pulled out a couple of slices of bread and butter, a big apple, and some cookies, mostly broken into crumbs. I took something too," said Harry, drawing out a sticky wad of gingerbread around which he had wrapped a piece of roast beef. Peggy's eyes glowed victoriously. It was evident that the boys were in a frame of mind favorable for her scheme. "What's it all about, anyway?" she asked. "I told you just nothing," said Ted promptly. "We got out early today 'cause Miss Green is sick and we needn't go back till tomorrow. So on our way home we stopped at the store. Harry hadn't spent his allowance at all this week and I had 5 cents left of mine. And Mr. Pratt, he had the greatest pistol you ever saw. You snapped it and it went off like a big firecracker, all without any kind of a cap. It made a most elegant noise, now I tell you. When we got home we went out and fired it at Cook. She's got some sense. She just laughed and said, 'What a fine creature it is, to be sure.' Then we crept up here and Nurse was sitting by the window. She never heard us and I pulled the trigger and pop. Oh, you ought to have seen her." Teddy slapped his knees and danced up and down in his glee. "She jumped about 10 feet and she got just white. And then didn't she scold? Said we weren't little gentlemen, that no nice boy would scare a woman, just as if a toy pistol ought to scare anybody. Well, we didn't stay to hear all her talk. We went out to the hen yard and we—" He looked at Harry and both boys chuckled with wicked delight. "Oh, let me tell," said Harry. "Ted, he gave me the pistol and we crawled up soft to those cochinchinas Nurse got last week. Then all of a sudden he leaned over quick and caught that fat strutting rooster, and then I banged with the pistol right side of Mr. Rooster's head. And you never saw anything like it," continued Harry. "He gave the most awful squawk and jerked away like 240, and if you'll believe it, he did jump right out of Ted's hands. But he left all his tail feathers behind. Ha ha ha!" The two graceless imps danced around the room, shaking with laughter. Peggy thought it was a pretty good joke, too, though she knew perfectly well how dear to Nurse's heart those cochinchinas were. With them she had hoped to take a prize at the county fair. "Well," said Peggy, "what happened then?" The boys' hilarity vanished. "She came out," said Ted in disgust, "and she snatched the pistol away. She says she's going to burn it up, and she told us we'd have to go to bed without our supper. That's all we're punished for, just nothing, only a handful of old rooster feathers that will grow right out again." Peggy looked solemnly at the two boys. "Nurse treats us bad enough," she said impressively, "and we keep getting punished for nothing, but we're going to have a worse time yet. We're going to have a stepmother." Ted and Harry looked at her questioningly. "What's a stepmother?" asked Harry. "She's a bad, wicked woman who makes father think we're horrid. She'll turn Nurse away and we won't have even enough to eat." Harry stood gazing with frightened eyes, but Ted sniffed rather contemptuously. "Huh! Stepmother just means a lady who marries father and comes here to live and we call her Mama. I know, 'cause I had stepmother in my spelling lesson and Miss Green told me." "That's all right," said Peggy severely, "but that doesn't say what kind of a woman she is, does it? And I know she will be horrid. Nurse says they always whip and punish children and make their own fathers hate 'em. Cora May said so too, for her grandmother told her." Here she remembered that Cora's new mother must be home by now. She wondered why Cora hadn't sent for Dr. Clayton to take her back to her grandmother. "It's just as well," she thought mournfully, for he would probably side with the stepmother himself. The boys looked miserable enough. "When's the stepmother coming?" asked Ted. "I don't know, but soon, maybe tomorrow." Soon, to Peggy's mind, could not mean a date much farther off. "Will she beat us just as soon as she comes?" Harry got nearer Peggy and held on to her dress. "Not if I know it," said Peggy with determination. In the excitement of planning her campaign, she had lost something of her own first terrible feelings. She spoke now like an already successful general. "I am going to run away before she comes. I'm going this very afternoon, and if you want to, you can come with me." "Where are you going?" said Ted in an awed whisper. "I'm going to Elsie Baker's in Scranton. Mrs. Baker will be glad to have us, I know. She will keep us till I can earn enough money to support all of us." Peggy's tone of assurance was a wonderful thing to hear, but Ted was not quite satisfied. "Supposing father comes after us and takes us back home? Then he'd whip us sure for running away." Peggy shook her head impatiently. "Don't you see, he won't want us to come back. Stepmother will make him hate us, and she'll be so glad we are gone that he will be glad too." "Oh, dear!" Harry's lip trembled. "I don't want father to hate us. I don't want any wicked old stepmother." Peggy put her arms around him and kissed him. "If we go away before she comes, perhaps father will love us by and by. Maybe he will get tired of stepmother and send her off. Then we can come back." She said this to comfort Harry. In her own mind she was quite sure that once in the power of a stepmother, even Dr. Clayton himself would be helpless. End of chapter 8.